summer afternoon. Some years ago, a young girl was drowning. They pulled her out of the ocean and she was unconscious. An old man from a nearby cottage came by and hurriedly reached down for her to start mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. A furious man came by just then and said, "Stop it, everybody stop. I have CPR training. I will take care of this. Stay out of my way." Well, the old man who started to help the girl felt, okay, I'll step aside. And so he watched as this man did manage to get this girl going, but she regained consciousness after 2 hours of CPR. The people around them were thrilled. They applauded this man for what he had done. And the old man, who looked very happy about all this, congratulated the fellow as well. But after a couple hours, the man passed out from the exertion in the hot summer sun. He couldn't breathe. He became unconscious. A few minutes later, though, he woke up in an ambulance, rushing him to the hospital, and beside him was this old man who had been just checking his pulse rate. The old man had done CPR on this man while he was unconscious. This time he learned that the old man was a doctor. "Why didn't you tell me you're a doctor?" he said. The doctor just smiled and says, "It doesn't matter to me whether you call me a doctor or not. A precious life was in danger. I became a doctor not for fame or wealth, but to save lives. We had the same goal, you and I was glad to see that you were helping save this girl." He went on, he says, "Nothing can surpass the feeling that you have just saved another life. There's a lot of things to be protected," he said, "more than our egos." The previously proud, now teary-eyed first man humbly said, "Well, you have just saved 2 lives today." He was humbled by what had happened. What is humility? Well, some people say humility is the quality or condition of being humble, modest of opinion, or estimate of one's own importance or own rank. Another person said humility is freedom from pride or arrogance. We read about Moses every week, and Moses said of himself that he was the most humble man on the earth, which sounds not too humble to me. So how do we reconcile this humble man saying something that sounds prideful? Well, being humble doesn't mean being a nobody. It just means being no more of a somebody than you ought to be. After all, Moses, who was considered the greatest of all the prophets, is described in the Torah as very anav, which is the Hebrew word for humble, more than any other men who were upon the face of the earth. Anav in Hebrew means limiting oneself to an appropriate amount of space while leaving room for others. That's true humility. If a leader as great as Moses was so humble, then there is surely more to humility than the shrinking meekness we ordinarily associate with the term. In other words, humility doesn't mean meekness. Moses was certainly not a meek man. What Moses meant when he said this, that he was the most humble man on the earth, was that he was called to be and accepted the responsibility that came with that call. He knew his place. That's why he gave up his sweet life as a shepherd, accepted his call to be the number 2 man in all of Egypt, and finally grasped his call to deliver our ancestors from slavery to Pharaoh. It's no wonder that Moses' grave is not findable in Israel. You would think as men, as great as Moses was, there would be a shrine. But nobody knows where Moses died. And he meant it that way, and God did too. Why? It wasn't about Moses. It was about God. It was about Hashem. Moses was humble. He knew what his life was all about. That's true humility, finding your place. Too often we human beings let our pride get in the way of our realization of whom we really are. We think of ourselves as more highly than we ought to. We put ourselves first before others. We would rather take the high seat in the synagogue or life rather than the lowly seat in the synagogue or life. We humans need to learn humility. Both it and humble, the word humility and humble, both have their origins in a Latin word that means low. So to be humble and exercise humility means to be lowly. It doesn't mean, though, a doormat. It just means low. Paul wanted his people to be humble. That's one of the reasons that he wrote the letter we're studying now, Philippians. Paul had everything in the world to be proud about. He was a top rabbi, a scholar. He studied under Gamaliel, the leading rabbi of the world at that time. He understood the special revelation he had when Yeshua asked him why he was persecuting him by going after the new Jewish believers in Yeshua. Remember, Paul was responsible for the literal deaths of many Messianic Jews until he got knocked off his high horse and went blind for a while, which is what caused him to be humbled. It was after then that God chose this little Jewish man as his emissary to the Gentile world, after he was humbled. So we studied Galatians before, a letter in which we not only Paul confessed a lot of his failures, but said some things that were bound to make him very unpopular with many of his own Jewish people, even many of his own Messianic Jewish people. What was the message Paul said that was so potentially problematic? He said, let the Gentiles come in as Gentiles. They don't have to convert to Judaism first. That was a very unpopular message for Paul to say, but he had been humbled and was willing to speak the truth if it meant even him suffering. Then we studied Romans, the book of Romans, which is all about Paul's understanding of God, of salvation, and what he was doing to help reach his own people, Israel. Remember Romans 1:16 said, I am not ashamed of the good news of the Messiah, for it's the power of God unto salvation to all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, or to the Jew especially and also to the Gentile. That was Paul's calling in life. Even though he was the apostle to the Gentiles, on his heart always was his people. Romans 9-11, we studied how Paul saw the future of Israel's salvation tied up with the Gentile people coming to the faith in the Messiah. The olive tree connection in Romans 11. Paul saw that God was going to graft Gentiles into this natural olive tree, and ultimately the natural branches, that is the Jewish people, would be grafted back in. So now, in the interest of building up the Messianic community, he's writing to one congregation in a Roman state called Macedonia. Macedonia in the city of Philippi. So as we continue to examine Paul's writing to the Philippians, we remember that he really loves these people. These are some of his favorite people in all the world. I think we're having some technical difficulties with our PowerPoint based on the size of the little slides that I saw. So I'm not going to ask David to put up a map of the Mediterranean, but if you can find it and we can get a magnifying glass, maybe we're going to see so we can locate ourselves. But just think about where Italy and Greece are today. Macedonia was in what's now called Greece. It was a state of Rome, a city-state of Rome. And Philippi was very important. I want us to get into our heads, into the mind of Paul right now, and learn what this is all about. With the issue of Gentiles coming to faith in Yeshua, Paul is ready to bring this new message to the cities he visited in his previous mission to Asia Minor, which is now modern-day Turkey. In Acts chapter 16, Paul received a vision that opened up the spread of the good news of Yeshua to Macedonia, as I said, modern-day Greece. The vision went like this. This is in Acts 16, 9 through 10. There is a vision appeared to Shaul at night. A man from Macedonia was standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." As soon as he had seen the vision, we lost no time getting ready to leave for Macedonia, for we concluded that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. Remember, Paul was a very successful Jewish rabbi, and now he's being called to travel all over the Gentile world preaching the good news. Come over to Macedonia. The Messianic community in Philippi, which is a city in Macedonia, was very small, with Lydia and her household coming to believe in Yeshua, read Acts 16, because there were very few Jews in Philippi. So for them to have a congregation, it was not made up of Jewish people, it was mostly made up of non-Jews. It appears that they all met in the house of a woman named Lydia, which would be the beginning of the Philippian Messianic community. Now, although the letter to the Philippians was targeted initially to these people in Philippi, we know that the intention was that this letter would spread throughout the world at that time. It's relevant to us for that purpose. We're not Philippians, we're Marylanders, but this is relevant to us today. Paul said, after this letter has been read to you, have it read also in the congregation of Laodicea, and you in turn are to read the letter that will come from Laodicea. In other words, spread this letter around. It was common. They did not have television. They didn't have radio. They didn't have mimeograph machines, or whatever those things are called, copy machines, or fax machines, or cell phones. How did the word spread? Letters were copied. Handwritten letters were spread about in the world of that day. So, and again, I want to say a lot of the material I'm talking about this morning comes from a commentary that I'm publishing by Sean Emsley on the book of Philippians. So I don't want to take credit for everything. So it says in Acts 1:8, "But you will receive power when the Ruach HaKodesh comes upon you, and you will be witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all of Yehuda and Shomron, indeed to the ends of the earth," which was Philippi. With these words, the mission to reach the world with the message of Yeshua began. And starting with Jerusalem and Judea, the message of Yeshua spread among the Jews of the land of Israel. The earliest Messianic community was a movement of Jews in Israel. But with the message of Yeshua moving to the ends of the earth, the doors were now open to the Gentile world. After experiencing the vision that I just read to you, Paul sets out immediately to spread the message of Yeshua in Macedonia, specifically in Philippi, a colony of Rome. Interesting about Lydia, the one woman mentioned by name in this section, it says that she's a God-fearer. A God-fearer. She recognized that even though she wasn't Jewish, she was called as a God-fearer to follow the Jewish way. She was a God-fearer. She was a Gentile that chose to follow Jewish ways. God-fearers were Gentile adherents to Judaism without a local Jewish population. It's also possible that some of the women that Paul was ministering to in Philippi were actual literal converts to Judaism, given that conversion to Judaism by Gentile women was easier than it was for men to be converted because of the practice of circumcision. So the Messianic community in Philippi began with Lydia and her family, her household, some of her friends, who believed in Yeshua. So by the conclusion of Paul's first visit to Philippi in Acts 16, there was a group of Yeshua followers that appeared to be meeting at Lydia's house, which would be the beginning, as I said, of the Philippian Messianic community. You might find it interesting that Lydia's grandmother and mother were Messianic Jews, so she was actually a third generation of Messianic Jews. I have a friend who's married to a third generation Messianic Jewish believer, and now there's two more, because my friend and his wife had children, and their children had other children. 5 generations of Messianic Jewish people in Detroit. If you ever want to go to his congregation when you're in Detroit, let me know and I'll hook you up. He's a great guy. He used to live with me in Chicago when he was kind of a young believer who was ready to save the world. And I said, you got to go to school first. And he said, well, did Paul go to school? I said, yes. How about Peter? No. Well, then I'm not going to go to school either, he said. And I said, well, you have to move out of the house if you don't go to Moody Bible Institute Jewish Studies program, because that's where you'll get trained. So he went, and he's doing a great job. It's a nice congregation. So Paul reveals some purposes in this letter early on. He says he wants to visit the Philippians to thank them for the gifts they had sent him upon hearing that he was now in Rome. The letter that he wanted to write them showed something about Paul. It showed humility, the theme of today's message. Paul, second, expressed gratitude for his relationship with the Philippians by practicing humility. He actually expressed his appreciation. He practiced humility. And finally, building on the Philippians' closeness and mutual affection for Paul, he speaks to them as their spiritual leader, calling them to unity grounded in humility. I want to tell you something. If you don't have unity, you can't have humility. If you don't have humility, you can't have unity. They go together. It's good that we're learning about humility today. But Paul was talking about humility that was exemplified in the life and death of Yeshua described in Philippians 2. So he was preaching humility to these people in Philippi. So if you go back to the first chapter of Philippians, I'll just make a couple of comments here because we're a little short on time today. It starts out from Shaul and Timothy, slaves of the Messiah Yeshua. To all God's people united with Messiah Yeshua and living in Philippi, along with the congregational leaders and shammashims. The letter here, it states, is written by Shaul, also known as the Apostle Paul. Now I want to make clear what happened here. Shaul was Paul's Hebrew name. Shaul is like Saul is a shortened form of saying Shaul. So where did Paul come from? I'm sure you've wondered. A lot of people have said, well, this is when he decided to not be Jewish anymore, so he took a Roman name. You may have heard that teaching. Or that this Gentile name was usually chosen based on a similar sound or the relationship to the person's Hebrew name. Shaul or Saul, Paul, they sound similar, don't they? Neither are true. Neither are true. In Acts 13, verse 9, we encounter Paul's 2 names together. It says, then Shaul, also known as Paul, filled with the Ruach HaKodesh, stared straight at him and said, from this point forward in Acts, Luke refers to Shaul by his name Paul. This name change from Shaul to Paul in Acts could be understood as marking a shift of his focus, of his ministry from Jews to Gentiles. It could be to say, I'm no longer Saul the rabbi, Shaul the rabbi, now I'm Paul the apostle. It's a little bit unclear what his name was all about, but I believe that he never changed his name. He always maintained 2 names, like I have 2 names, and Jews do in our days today. I have a Hebrew name, Baruch, and my parents gave me an English name, Barry. Most Jewish boys at their circumcision are given a Hebrew name, no matter what country they live in, and then given another name that's more common in the country they live in. I think that's what was going on here. Timothy, back to Timothy, was one of Paul's most loyal co-workers who joined Paul as he was beginning on his second missionary journey to Asia Minor, the Messianic communities in Asia Minor, which we talked about when we talked about Galatians. Remember, that was Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey. Paul took Timothy with him. He was Paul's son in the Lord, as it says. When they went to Jerusalem to talk to the Jerusalem council whether Gentiles could get into the movement without becoming converts to Judaism first, Timothy was with Paul. Timothy was a very important part of Paul's service, Paul's ministry. Timothy was the son of a Greek father and a Jewish mother who had become a follower of Yeshua. Timothy's grandmother was named Eunice, a Messianic Jew. And so there was a line of Messianic Jews in her family. And we don't know exactly why Timothy was not circumcised. Some say that since Timothy's father was a Greek, he didn't want his son to undergo circumcision because maybe it would violate the Greek ideal of the perfect body. You know, the Greek Olympic concepts. If you ever see the old Greeks, they all have perfect bodies, at least the ones that you see. I imagine there were some fat Greeks as well, but you don't see them because the idea of the Greek was the perfect body. It was one of their religions, if you will. And maybe Timothy's father didn't want him to be circumcised because then he would be missing a part, or part of a part, his foreskin. And then maybe they wanted, Timothy's father didn't want his son to be separated from Gentile society. Maybe Timothy's father didn't want him to be involved with all this Jewish stuff because he didn't understand it. Remember, Timothy had a special calling on his life, and that was to go with Paul to preach the good news to the Jews and the Gentiles. So there was some confusion over his identity. So Paul says, forget about it, we'll just circumcise you. Talking about humility between Paul and Timothy to go undergo this adult circumcision requires a lot of humility. You definitely have to humble yourself, number one, to allow yourself as a grown-up man to be circumcised, which is, I don't have to get graphic, right? Everybody knows what circumcision is. Sometimes I wonder. If you don't, please ask somebody else. And Paul, to do the circumcision, required a certain amount of humility. So in doing this circumcision, they both were practicing humility for the greater good. So Paul was lifting up Timothy as very important to him. And he said that they were both, Paul and Timothy, they were both slaves of the Messiah Yeshua. He used the word slave. His self-identification wasn't we were preachers, we were evangelists, we were teachers. He said, no, we were slaves. Slaves. He actually uses the Greek word for slave, which is doulos. And later on, Yeshua is referred to as slave. The same Greek word is applied to him. So the idea of Paul and Timothy going together, he said, we're both slaves. We're both slaves to the Messiah. So Paul is making clear to the Philippians what following Yeshua means. And what is that? Their new model for the Philippians had to be slavery. Now I know in America slavery means something different, but in the Greek world, slaves were common. People owned slaves. They sometimes set their slaves free. So Paul is saying he wants the Philippians to know that both him and Timothy saw themselves as slaves to the Messiah. Does that apply to any of us? Just think for a second. If we are called to be followers of Yeshua, do you realize we're not called necessarily to be dancers, singers, preachers, rabbis, counselors. We're all called to be slaves. Think about that for a minute. For Paul, being a slave of the Messiah was a wholeheartedly joyful act of submission to Yeshua as his Lord. Being a slave of the Messiah was to Paul the realization of true freedom. Enslavement was no longer to sin and death, but to Yeshua and life. In his slavery to Yeshua, he was truly free from enslavement to sin. Which would you choose? Would you rather be a slave to sin or a slave to Yeshua?
Yeshua.
It's obvious, right? But are we practicing slavery to Yeshua? Are we enslaving ourselves to the Messiah? Think about it. Paul is also connecting the word doulos, or slavery, to the Hebrew word ebed. All the prophets of Israel were called ebed Adonai, servants of, slaves of God, servants of the Most High. So he's actually connecting this concept of slavery from the Tanakh to the Brit Hadashah, because he wanted everybody to understand that their goal, their life's work, had to be a slave. Now I want to wrap up here because we're a little bit behind. I want to just kind of close with this idea, some comments about humility. Because if we're really going to be slaves, which is really what we are called to do, we have to learn about humility. Now, it's unfortunate that humility sounds a lot like humiliation. And it's easy to get the wrong impression of this. In the traditional Jewish understanding of humility, it has nothing to do with being debased or a stricken creature on the earth somewhere. No, humility is associated with spiritual perfection. When humility affects depression, it is defective. When it is genuine, it inspires joy, courage, and inner dignity. Listen, true humility is always associated with self-esteem. It sounds counterintuitive, but the one who's the most humble also has the most self-esteem. Lack of self-esteem leads to unholy and false feelings of worthlessness. If we're servants of the Most High, by partnering with his Messiah and Messiah's Son, with his Messiah and Son, our self-esteem should automatically jump up. Do you realize that in reality, I'm not speaking poetically, in reality, the God of heaven and earth has chosen each one of us to be a slave of Yeshua. That's no small job description. It's an honor. Our self-esteem should be very high. God himself believes that everyone in this room is worthy of being a servant of the Most High. You may not see yourself that way. It doesn't matter. We're all called to be slaves. We should be humbled by this calling. Not proud, not boastful, but humbled and feel great about it. So the letter to the Philippians is all about humility. And we see some ways that Rav Shaul demonstrated humility. And finally, he identified himself as a slave of Yeshua. May God teach each one of us how to be more of a slave to the Messiah himself. For that is the calling that God has on every person's life in this room. We're called to be servants, slaves of the Most High. Amen. Please stand for a later.